to tell you about the two presenters we have here. Jessica Murad is an attorney with the District Attorney's Office in Contra Costa County, and Katrina Natale. What's your role? Are you a victim advocate?
No, I'm the task force director.
Task force director, our human trafficking task force director for Contra Costa County. Katrina is also here with us. So I'm going to go ahead and let them take it away. Please feel free to drop questions as things come up. We'll try and do questions towards the end of like every section, but we may also have to limit those if we want to get through all the material, and we can do some at the end as well.
Good morning, everybody. Let me get us back to our starting slide here. There we go. Okay, so good morning, I'm Katrina. Jessica is with me here, and we are really thrilled to have this chance to talk with you this morning. And what we're going to be talking about is we're doing a kind of an overview of human trafficking. We call it Human Trafficking 102 because we're going a little bit more in depth into some of the topics. So you may have already had training with a Human Trafficking 101. And we're also looking at this and have developed this training based on the collaboration that we are developing within our task force between our law enforcement partners, the district attorney's office, and the victim service providers and other county and state and federal agencies that we work with on human trafficking. So you'll notice that kind of throughout, we'll be making reference to how some of the principles we talk about are foundations of that collaboration and what that looks like and what specific practices we might be trying to engage in order to work collaboratively and to really bring the greatest benefit from the multidisciplinary approach that we have in the task force. Let me jump us along. This is a requisite slide. You will find out through this process that we are a federally funded task force. So we have funding. We have funding through the Office of Victims of Crime, which is under the U.S. Department of Justice, and they provide funding both to our victim service providers as well as the law enforcement side of the grant. And so we're required to kind of put up this disclaimer and make sure that you all know that we received that funding and that they have approved the content of this presentation. So this morning, we're going to be kind of walking you through a number of sections, and we're going to start out by just kind of introducing folks to the task force. And I believe there's maybe one or a couple of task force representatives on this call. So hopefully this will be interesting to you to kind of see what our task force looks like. As well, for those of you that are not familiar with the task force model, we will hopefully give you a better idea of what that looks like and an understanding of, you know, when we use the words task force, what that means, because I know in different contexts that can mean a lot of different things to different people. So we're going to try to make clear what that looks like for us. We will talk about a little bit about human trafficking in Contra Costa County and what we know about that, what kind of situations we see and come across. We'll talk about the crimes of human trafficking, and we are lucky to have Jessica Murad, our sex trafficking prosecutor, with us, who can really go into depth. So if you've got questions or things you've never understood, she's mostly going to talk about California law. We will make reference to federal, but as we are in California and our office prosecutes using California law, we'll focus there. We'll spend a little time talking about the dynamics of human trafficking. And we put that in there to, and this is really a nod to being collaborative and multidisciplinary, to really share with you our common understanding within the task force of how we approach human trafficking, how we understand it, what we consider to be sort of the key dynamics that are going on that can make working in this space really challenging. Then we'll talk about a little bit about what our investigators, when we have folks investigating human trafficking, what some of their approaches are, and then we'll talk about kind of our guiding principles around comprehensive services for victims and working toward meeting that standard. And so with that, we'll jump into talking a little bit about the task force itself. So the Contra Costa Human Trafficking Task Force was developed and originally grant funded in 2018. So it was a joint initiative of the District Attorney's Office and the Alliance to End Abuse. Many of you may be familiar with the Alliance. It is a body that exists within the Employment and Human Services Division of our county governance. And the Alliance really focuses on making an impact on interpersonal violence in the county. So they work across sort of the 5 dimensions of interpersonal violence. This was one of those initiatives. And they really were stepping in as kind of the other half, the co-leadership component of our task force, which I'll talk about in a minute. Our vision, which we are currently actually revising, but our existing vision right now is to eradicate all forms of human trafficking in the county through collaborative and multidisciplinary efforts, which we'll talk about, with 2 kind of main objectives: to identify and support victim survivors and to hold traffickers accountable through effective prosecution. And I'll say just a quick word about the language. So you're going to notice throughout this presentation that victim and survivor is used kind of interchangeably. That is a nod to the fact that we are a collaborative task force, and we do different folks within that task force use different language. It is much more common on the law enforcement side of things to refer to use the terminology victim, whereas in the service provider world, survivor is more common. And so we're kind of using both here, and I imagine that someday we may arrive at a point where we're using the same words all the time, but this is where we're at right now. And so in terms of who we are, I said a little bit about this, but we just recently, fall of 2022, received our second grant through the federal government. So the way this grant works is it is intended, the purpose is called the Enhanced Collaborative Model for Anti-Human Trafficking Task Forces. And so it has basically, it brings together in co-leadership a representative, an agency that represents the law enforcement side, and a lead agency on the victim service side. So in our case, Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office is the law enforcement agency, and Community Violence Solutions, which is a local county-based, they work in several counties, but they have a lot of offices here in Contra Costa County, nonprofit organization that works on ending sexual assault and family violence, and they have a human trafficking program. They are our 24/7, 365 days a year service provider in this county. And so on the left side of your screen, you'll see that there's some detail in terms of who's a part of the task force through the DA's office. So I am the task force director. I am employed by the DA's office, but I sit sort of in the middle of the task force in the sense that I'm involved in a lot of the coordination. We also have a designated sex trafficking investigator and a labor trafficking investigator. We have our human trafficking unit, which is made up of 2 prosecutors, Jessica, who's here with us today, and Kabo Adoaji, who is our labor trafficking prosecutor. We have 2 specialized interns, and then we have a number of federal partners, including the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, and Homeland Security Investigations that have signed MOUs with us. And then you'll see on the side of the Victim Service Lead Agency, Community Violence Solution is the lead agency. And then, I see there's a small error on the slide. So Claudia was our co-coordinator. She has, the Alliance stepped away this year and turned things over to Community Violence Solutions. So she is now coordinating the coalition in our county. And then we have our funded victim service partners. So those agencies are all receiving funds through the grant to work with the task force to serve survivors of human trafficking. So CVS, as we've talked about before, Bay Area Legal Aid, who really specializes in providing, in particular, immigration support to survivors of human trafficking, but they also work in other kind of more classic legal aid areas. So benefits, welfare benefits, representation around landlord-tenant, all those kind of areas. International Rescue Committee, which is an international NGO. We work with them quite a bit around working with clients who are foreign nationals or immigrant clients, particularly in the labor trafficking space, but also sex trafficking as needed. Justice at Last, who provides primarily victims' rights representation. And so they will oftentimes work with our clients as their legal representatives in the court process, applying some of the victims' rights principles that are provided for in the California Constitution. They also work and are developing with us a project around vacatur, which is a legal means by which survivors of human trafficking can clear their criminal records if they can establish that their crimes or arrests were related to directly resulting from having been trafficked. And then finally, My Sister's House, which is a shelter in the Sacramento area. They provide shelter and transitional housing, and they have a lot of culturally specific services, which are great for, particularly for some of our clients that may have an immigrant background and feel more comfortable in that setting. Obviously, we work with a number of other providers as well here locally. Stand is a part of our task force. Cali House has been a part of our task force in the past. So this is kind of the short list of folks that are receiving some funds. And then in addition to those folks, we have about 30 other agencies, whether law enforcement, community-based, or governmental, that are a part of the task force. And then finally, we're going to kind of weave throughout this presentation more on our approach, but it's based around sort of 4 key principles. So we're multidisciplinary, meaning we're bringing folks together from all different areas of specialty to try to work on human trafficking together, right, toward the mission of identifying survivors and getting them connected with services, and where appropriate, holding traffickers accountable for their behavior. We also strive to be trauma informed, and we'll talk throughout the presentation about how that comes into play, specifically in working on human trafficking cases. Victim-centered, and which we'll also talk about later. And then we strive for comprehensive services. And I will say, and I'll say this more later when we get to that part of the presentation, you know, all of these things we'll be the first ones to admit. We have not found sort of the golden ticket and figured out how to do all of this perfectly, but these are sort of our framing principles that we are working toward. And as many of you are service providers, when we talk about comprehensive services, you know, you probably know very well that, you know, we fall short where, you know, we don't have all the resources we need. And there's a very high demand for the resources that are available, but we're working slowly toward trying to have more of what human trafficking survivors need to be able to move away from trafficking situations. So really quickly, we'll go ahead and just talk about partner roles. And so I just want to highlight up front, and this is something that early on in my time with the task force, we really wanted to make explicit sort of what each of the different groups that are in the task force, what's their role, what are their goals, what are they looking to do? And so Jessica is going to talk to us a little bit about prosecution to start us off on that.
Yeah, so obviously prosecution has a different goal than our victim service providers and similar goals to our law enforcement. I want a case to be presented to me that I can actually prosecute effectively, meaning get a conviction at the end of the day. So not only are my goals to successfully prosecute these traffickers, but I also do have the goal of making the victims as whole as possible at the end. I'm sure since we have lots of service providers here, everyone is familiar with Marsy's Law. That's a part of the California state constitution. And so I have to make sure that victims' rights are heard throughout the process, their wants, their needs, and at the end, if there is any restitution that we can possibly get them, whether that be through the Victims Compensation Board or working directly with our providers. But at the end of the day, my main goal is to make sure that these people are held accountable for what they're doing to our survivors.
Great. And as Jessica mentioned, you know, the other piece of that and what feeds into Jessica's work as a prosecutor are the investigations. And so that's where law enforcement comes in. And so, you know, their focus is on public safety and investigating human trafficking and preventing traffickers from continuing to exploit community members. And so, that looks like trying to identify first who might be engaged in trafficking. Very often through that process, they come in contact with victims or survivors of human trafficking. And so working to get them connected with service providers. And then, having an eye to how do we try to prevent this going forward. And then victim service providers, of course, come out this right with a slightly different role in mind. So they're not focused on the prosecution or criminal accountability, but on supporting and empowering survivors to achieve freedom away from exploitation, and also being focused on harm reduction and safety, knowing that if some of the folks out there have worked with survivors of human trafficking, it takes time, and folks that may not always identify as, initially or even later as victims of human trafficking, even if they do, it can be very challenging for them to decide to step away from that lifestyle. And we'll talk a little bit later about, or to sort of remove themselves from the exploitation. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. And how that poses a challenge, I think, in these collaborative settings, right? And how we understand the process that survivors go through. So I think at this point, if we have a couple questions, we can talk about those. So if you have a question, please drop it into the Q&A portion. And if not, we can move on. I'm not
At the moment, we don't have any, but we'll keep an eye out.
Okay, perfect. Got it. Sorry, let me close this. So let's move. So we want to talk for a minute about sort of what do we know about human trafficking in Contra Costa County. And everybody always wants to have statistics like how much human trafficking is there in Contra Costa County. I will tell you, and many of you who've worked in the human trafficking space for a while will probably know this to be true as well. We don't know exactly. And it is a very challenging topic to study and to try to understand, because so much of it is underground and invisible. And so it can be very difficult to make those determinations. So we don't try to offer statistics at the county level. It is something we have talked about, sort of what kind of useful data could we generate? And we're in the process of sort of trying to think that through. But what I can say is that there is a national human trafficking hotline, and that hotline does track statistics. And it is in no means a comprehensive, it's not, can't tell us the total amount of trafficking in the country. But in the last year that they have data, which was, if I'm not mistaken, 2020, in that data set, they had close to 14,000 reports of human trafficking in the United States. And of those, California, the state, comprised almost 15% of all those cases. So if you imagine there are 50 states, California usually has about 20% more cases reported than any other state. I think second is Texas, and after that, it may be Florida or New York. I can't remember exactly. So what we do know is that there is a significant amount of human trafficking in California. Our office in the years from 2019 through 2021, we filed human trafficking charges in 48 cases. So not an insubstantial number if you think about that, because that in order to be filed as a case, those are usually the situations where there's a substantial amount of evidence and where it's fairly clear that was going on. So that's a little bit about sort of what we know statistically. I know that leaves people usually a little bit unsatisfied, but it is true throughout the country and throughout the world that it is very difficult to quantify human trafficking. What a lot of people talk about, and what I think is a valuable lens to look at this through, is really vulnerability, which we'll talk about later. And wherever you have vulnerability, you will usually have human trafficking. And we will talk about kind of what some of those vulnerabilities are a little bit later in the presentation. So Jessica's gonna talk here a little bit about how we see it here in the county.
Yeah, so I'm sure it looks very similar to how many of you are seeing it in your counties. It sounds like we have people here from all over the state. This list, both of them are not inclusive. There's many more ways that we've seen labor and sex trafficking in Contra Costa County. But of course, to no surprise, online dating sites and social media is where I'm so far getting a majority of my cases. Instagram, Snapchat, it is amazing to see how many of these traffickers are bold enough to identify themselves as pimps on Instagram, and not in the way that, you know, we think of it in pop culture. They're doing it in ways that they think are sneaky. And then when we pull their information from Instagram, we are seeing them actively recruit survivors via direct messaging. So it is prevalent in our county, just like it's prevalent in, I'm sure, most of yours. Strip clubs and any adult entertainment, whether that be bars, excuse me, I am losing my voice today, whether that be bars of any sorts, hotels and motels, even in areas that in our county we would think maybe this wouldn't be an issue. We've had issues with hotels in areas like San Ramon and Danville. And then of course, the big one where I'm getting, unfortunately, a lot of cases from our group homes and treatment facilities. I'm prepping for a trial right now where I'm trying to find one of my victims who's 13 years old, and she was recruited by a 17-year-old female at a group home and got into the life that way. She's been communicating with us off and on, and recently I found out her family tried to get her into a treatment facility, and she was recruited out of that treatment facility, and now we think she's working somewhere in Southern California. So unfortunately, that is what we are dealing with, but we still are finding sex trafficking through escort services, residential brothels, again in areas in our county where you wouldn't think to see them. Moraga, recently we had a residential brothel. Of course, street and gang commercial sex work. We have a blade here in Contra Costa County. It's the 23rd Street corridor in Richmond, and we still get a lot of cases out of there as well. So that's kind of what we're seeing as far as sex trafficking. Katrina, do you want to take labor trafficking or?
Yeah, I'll talk about labor trafficking real quick. And I realized the other night that I also, the phrase blade isn't, everybody doesn't understand it, and we use it a lot. So what we mean by that is simply a street level location where there is prevalent commercial sex work happening. So in our county, that is the 23rd and 24th Street areas in Richmond, in the city of Richmond. And you'll probably be familiar with similar locations throughout the Bay Area and the state of California. So, you know, Oakland has something similar, as does San Francisco. On the labor trafficking side of things, and we throughout this presentation are going to talk about both, because oftentimes when human trafficking gets talked about, the focus has historically been on sex trafficking. And what we know is that there is a lot of labor trafficking that goes unidentified. The number of successful cases that there have been for labor trafficking is very low everywhere in the country. But everything tells us from what we know about vulnerabilities that we should expect there's a significant amount that we're missing. And we also hear from our service providers that they are working with clients specifically that have been labor trafficked, that it may never have come to the attention of law enforcement. That is true for sex trafficking as well. But on the labor trafficking side, it's particularly notable. So in terms of where we see this in Contra Costa County, so we do have currently under prosecution a case related to labor trafficking. You know, that case involves domestic work. So this was an individual that was brought over from another country. She was recruited out of her home town or village, where the folks that she came to work for were a prominent family. And she alleges that when she came here, she was put to work kind of 24/7 in their home, taking care of children, the children there, cleaning the house, that sort of thing. And that she didn't have freedom of movement. She didn't have access to her documents. She wasn't being paid the the minimum wage that's required in the state. So there were a number of factors there. That's not an uncommon scenario, and that can be an incredibly difficult situation to kind of bring to light, right? Especially when folks are, their labor is happening inside a private home, right? Because very few people will know they're there or come in contact with them. We have also seen situations in caregiving and home health settings. In particular, these are not the big corporate establishments usually. That it can happen there, but where we have seen it in our county is more of the privately run, smaller scale, oftentimes family-owned businesses. And where they will bring folks in to work in those facilities, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes from outside of the United States. And you know, they live in the home 24 hours a day, and the expectation is that they will work 24 hours a day. And oftentimes in very difficult living conditions, you know, cots in the garage kind of scenario, or sleeping on the floor, that kind of thing. Another scenario where we can see it is in restaurants. Or food service or vending operations. Again, you know, where folks are expected, they may live on site or they may live at a residence together jointly, and are expected to be at work all day long for very long hours, not being properly compensated for that. They may not, the transportation to and from their living situation can be provided by the folks that are trafficking them. So they don't have freedom of movement. They may not have access to documents. They may not have legal status to be in the United States. And all of those things can sort of be wielded against them as a means of control and exploitation. And then finally, another big area that we see, and this, you know, is everywhere in the county, is illicit massage establishments or businesses. And so these are places that are offering massage services, but oftentimes the individuals working there are required to engage in commercial sex work. And this is another space where oftentimes the folks that are working there, not always, we have recently encountered folks that were living in the United States before they were recruited into that work. But oftentimes these are individuals coming from outside of the United States, frequently from East Asia or Southeast Asia. And you know, we talk about that in terms of labor trafficking, but it actually can be both. Sex trafficking and labor trafficking, because you have kind of both dimensions there. So they're expected to be in that business. They may live there, you know, 24 hours a day, and then have to work long hours and only get paid when they actually engage in providing the illicit services. So, you know, labor law is being violated. In addition, oftentimes they don't have freedom of movement. They may have threats made against them or their family members, not have access to their documents, etc. So those are just a few examples. And then I want to say, because a lot of these examples, we talked about folks that may have immigrated here. Labor trafficking also happens with folks that have lived in the United States their entire lives. So, you know, we can see it in agricultural settings, in the hospitality industry, in nail salons or beauty services, factories, construction and day labor, even peddling or sales rings. And again, you know, the folks that are end up oftentimes being exploited or trafficked have vulnerabilities that may make it difficult for them to earn a living or have access to the resources they need to survive. And so it puts them in a position of being vulnerable. And recruitment can, for labor trafficking, can look like legitimate advertising for work. And folks don't realize that the situation that they're entering into is going to be exploitative to them. So those are a few examples of labor trafficking. And so we're going to watch just a quick video clip, and I want to give a little bit of a trigger warning. So this video is part of an interview with a woman. Her name is Ori Freeman. She survived commercial sexual exploitation as a child, and then continuing sex trafficking into adulthood. She is an advocate for human trafficking survivors. She has been able to get away from the trafficking situation that she was in for some years now, and speaks quite a bit publicly about this. So because her story does have some details, if this, you know, feel free to mute if you'd rather not listen. And we're just gonna watch about 3 minutes of this clip. While you're watching, if you wouldn't mind, keep an ear out for what you hear as sort of vulnerabilities that might have made it possible for her trafficker to exploit her. And if you think of some, or if you hear some, type them into the Q&A or the chat, whichever one is working. And we'll talk about that in a bit.
I want to start off with a warning that this video does contain adult topics. Today, I would like to introduce you to Ori, an incredible woman who is a survivor of sex trafficking. And this is a topic that I am incredibly passionate about, and I think there's so much misinformation out there. So hopefully we can all learn something today, but also Ori's story is a story of hope. Regardless of what you've been through, there is hope.
My name is Ori. I am bold, brave, blunt, willing to fight, and that comes from a lot of the things that I've been through in my life. I was born at Chowchilla State Prison. My mother was fighting murder at the time when she had me. At 2 days, I was adopted by a single mother who worked 3 jobs in order to provide for me. I had a very normal childhood in the very beginning up until the age of 8, when I was molested by a family friend. By the time I was about 9.5, 10 years old, I experienced a rape, and there was no justice that was ever served. I didn't receive any counseling. My mother never had a conversation with me about it. I think it was very hard for her. So it was all these feelings of like insecurity and feeling like I don't belong, guilt and shame and dirtiness was bottling up inside. I ended up running away and met a friend. We went to this house, which was like a drug house. She left me and said, I'll be right back. In that house was a male sitting on the couch right next to me. For the first time in my life, somebody asked me, was I okay? After the rapes, after the molestation, after all the bullying, somebody finally asked me, was I okay? I told that man my life story in 30 seconds. And he didn't have to come and look for me. Like, he didn't have to come hunt like how normal traffickers do. I fell right on his doorstep. I was a kid in need. I needed shelter. I needed clothes. I needed food. And I was gonna need someone to take care of me because I was only 11 years old. And I just remember this look in his eye was just like this. I got her. And he started to groom me. And then that grooming process is he was preparing me to be trafficked. And I remember just freaking out in the back seat, like scared. He got out, was yelling, why are you crying? And he hit me. I want to just go home. I want to go home. And he was just like, where are you going to go? Nobody wants you. And I believed those lies. And he grabbed me by my hair and dragged me down the street. My knees were scraping the floor. It was other women out there. Nobody did anything. When you have been forced to sleep with 7 to 15 men and be raped and be 11 years old, I was like slowly dying. And after the first night, you suppress those feelings because any inch of hope that you have, any sense of I can get out, any feeling of there's a God, any feeling of I don't deserve this, you get beat. You ain't gonna survive out there. By the time I was...
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. I see there a couple have come through, but if we're gonna circle back around to talking about this video in a little bit when we talk about vulnerabilities. So if you heard stuff in there, type it into the chat. What you heard as potential vulnerabilities that she may have experienced. We'll talk about that in some slides that will come in a little bit.
12.
Let me stop that and move us to our next slide. Okay, so we are going to move into talking a little bit about the crimes associated with human trafficking, and Jessica, our resident expert, is going to kind of take us through there and give us some details.
And before we get going, we do have a couple questions, if that's okay. I can interject for just a minute.
Reminding me, yes.
Can you explain just in brief detail what Marcy's Law is for folks?
Of course, I'm sorry, I should have done that earlier. So like I said, it is actually a part of the California State Constitution, and it enumerates several rights that victims are entitled to when they go throughout the criminal justice process. And it starts pretty much the second a crime is reported, an officer is required to give out what we call a Marcy's card. That kind of tells them, hey, you are a victim of a crime and these are your rights. Those rights include that they're informed about every hearing that comes up during the course of the case. They have a right to be confidential in any of the paperwork that is included in the criminal justice system. So if somebody went to go pull the police report, just a member of the public, the victim's name would be redacted, their personal information would be redacted. We refer to them as Jane Doe in all court transcripts. They have a right to restitution, meaning if there has been a loss due to the fact that they were a victim of this crime, the defendant will be on the hook for those costs. And in the situation where a defendant can't afford it, the state is actually on the hook for that as well. And there's several different types of ways that they can do that. They can also actually object to any plea negotiation. That's where I see it most in my profession, where Marcy's rights comes into play, is where I've decided to settle a case. That is entirely up to me, but I have to make sure the judge knows how my victim feels about the resolution, whether she wants more time, whether she wants less time. They're also entitled to criminal protective orders as well throughout the criminal justice process. That's another aspect. Those are the ones that are coming to my mind at the moment.
Thank you. And then when working with youth in group homes or treatment facilities, are you seeing a lot of people being trafficked by youth within those homes, or are they usually from outside?
So unfortunately, it is usually youth inside those homes, obviously working for a trafficker. They're not doing it all by themselves. But I haven't seen it be any of the group home providers. Luckily, it is almost always an older female in the group home saying, hey, let's run away. I can go make us some money. We don't have to stay here.
Okay. And then Katrina, you might be able to answer this, but do you have any suggestions for when survivors are reluctant to speak to law enforcement?
Yeah, so this is a question that comes up a lot within the context of the task force, and our working position with our victim service providers is to the first kind of primary focus on stabilizing the victim or the survivor, giving them the resources that they need, building rapport, which can be so important, and empowering them to make decisions and finding out what they need, right? So, we have advocates that work with us here in the DA's office as well. We work quite a bit with the advocates from Community Violence Solutions. And so, the primary model that people operate on is that the choice is up to the victim. And of course, they will explain kind of what the benefits could be of participating in the criminal justice process and what some of the challenges might be, but that ultimately leaving that decision in their hands for the most part, with the idea of not replicating sort of the power dynamics that exist in their relationship with their exploiter, right? Where you don't have choice and you're being compelled to do things. They will certainly, Jessica, you might want to say more about this kind of from your standpoint or your position in terms of how you approach that with victims that you may come in contact with in your cases.
I really rely on our service providers for that. Unfortunately, when I talk to our survivors, they know I'm law enforcement. So if one of my officers hasn't already gotten through to them, it's rare that I'm the one to do that. So we're really lucky in our office that we have 2 victim advocates specifically trained on human trafficking. That is all they do. So that's who I really rely on in those situations.
Yeah. And if they do, also making clear that if they do decide to go forward and participate in the criminal justice process, that they will have support. And that they're not going to be sort of, oh, great, you've testified. Now we don't need to talk to you again. That this is an ongoing process. But I will say, and Jessica may have more to say about this, that it's very challenging because very often, and we'll talk about this more later in the presentation, when we encounter folks, it's a moment of crisis. It's a very difficult situation. It's, people are feeling very destabilized, can feel very isolating, very traumatizing. And that is not an ideal time to be making big life decisions, right? People are oftentimes very, very scared. And like I said, they may also not identify as a victim of crime. And so, in that situation, it's, difficult to, to expect that they would want to engage necessarily in a criminal justice process.
Mhm.
Part of
And
the,
just-
yeah, go ahead,
Oh, I
Natalie.
was just on a follow-up on that. So if the survivor has, say they have an arrest warrant out or other legal issues that are coming up, that doesn't deter your office from interacting with them as a victim and not as a offender, right?
Not at all. And I mean, we routinely work with other counties. If there are warrants outstanding, I mean, most of the time it's going to be for very petty things. But there are situations where, I mean, I recently just had one the other day where I had a victim that we were interviewing her because we believe she's being trafficked by one of my defendants. And unfortunately, she had an active arrest warrant out for being an accomplice in a homicide. There's nothing I can really do in that situation.
Yeah.
Be honest and have the officers be honest with her as well. Hey, we're investigating. You are a victim, 100% in our county, you're a victim. But at the end of the day, we are going to have to make sure that you are transported to the local authorities.
Gotcha.
So that's a hard part of the job.
Yeah. And then just a quick question of, will you be touching at all on the topic of drug trafficking, or is that not included within this task force?
No, so so that's an important distinction to be made, and maybe this is a good segue into Jessica's section. So when we talk about trafficking, I know that word itself can raise a lot of things in folks' mind. Drug trafficking being one of them, smuggling or trafficking folks across borders, which can be connected to, like human smuggling can be connected to human trafficking. We do see that sometimes, but it is something distinct, right? So human smuggling is the moving of people across borders, usually national borders, right? And that is a different crime than what we'll be talking about with human trafficking. There is, of course, and we could, if there's a follow-up question on this at the end, we could talk about, what we do see situations where there may be drug smuggling involved in trafficking situations. It is something that I don't know that we've had a case here in our office yet, but I know some other jurisdictions locally have, where they're seeing essentially labor trafficking by involving youth, particularly unhomed youth, in drug trafficking or drug dealing operations. And some offices have looked at that through the lens of labor trafficking, that those individuals were compelled into that role. And I think with that, we may need to just to stay on time, move on to Jessica's portion or next section, but we can always circle back around if people have follow-ups at the end.
Yes.
Right, Katrina, I think you have control of my.
Oh, I do. Sorry.
Next. All right. So California law versus federal law. Similar but different. You're going to see similar wording that actually means two very different things. So in California, in order for me to prove human trafficking, to file human trafficking charges, first of all, I have to, at the time of me actually filing the case, I have to believe that I can prove all charges beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 jurors unanimously. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people think, hey, can't you just file the case? Don't you have enough evidence right now and keep working on it? No, here in Contra Costa County, I have to be able to prove it to 12 jurors from the get-go. And what I have to be able to prove to them is that there was some sort of liberty deprivation that caused a survivor to either start or continue to work in the commercial sex industry, whether that be sex or labor. So obviously, or enforced labor services as well. And there's a bunch of enumerated crimes that can be related to that I'll go into in a little bit. Obviously, this is different if there's a victim. If there's a victim, you just take away the liberty deprivation portion, and I can just focus on that second aspect. That is the same for federal law. You'll see that force, fraud, and coercion is only necessary when we're prosecuting situations where the victims are adults. But under federal law, it's that an individual is recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, receiving, and transferring and doing that by force, fraud, or coercion in order to further commercial sex acts or labor and any of those types of wage theft crimes. So the federal law was not even created until 2000, the Trafficking Victims Prevention Act. But it is something that has continued to receive federal funding. Basically, the way I think of it is California's law is stricter. If I can file something as human trafficking in California, and the federal government wanted to take it from me for any number of reasons, they could file charges. I couldn't do the same. If the federal government had a case that they felt was human trafficking, it might not be enough for me to prosecute it as human trafficking here in California. But that doesn't mean that I don't have other crimes I can still prosecute under. If you go to the next slide, Katrina. Okay. So for sex trafficking of adults, we prosecute that under Penal Code Section 236.1 sub B, the deprivation of personal liberties, with the intent to continue either pimping, pandering, procurement, even distribution of pornography, any of those enumerated crimes with the deprivation of personal liberty can be considered human trafficking. For minors, just even attempting to get them into this lifestyle, enough evidence of that is enough for me to prosecute for sex trafficking of minors. And the best part about it, I think of it as kind of strict liability. It's not one of those situations with like statutory rape where the adult needed to know that the victim was a minor. If the victim is under 18, I can pretty much get to sex trafficking of a minor. So it's a great tool in our toolkit when minors are involved. Labor trafficking is similar. The intent, though, is to obtain forced labor or services. Any number of enumerated labor crimes, which can include wage theft, labor theft, extortion, etc. Next, please. Right. So what does deprivation of liberty mean? This is where it's going to sound similar to the federal crimes because it does include force, fraud, coercion. But this list, it's a little bit different because I can't just have force, I can't just have fraud, and I just can't have coercion. It's usually multiple of these aspects that makes it so that I can really prove deprivation of liberty. Because I think when we think of force, right, domestic violence, forceful restraint, there's going to be a lot of examples of that in these relationships. But I actually have to prove that the force caused or induced that survivor to engage in the trafficking. So just a domestic violence relationship where the survivor happens to be a commercial sex worker, 9 times out of 10 isn't going to be enough. And it's hard to get evidence that shows that it's the direct reason why somebody is engaging in commercial sex work. So we have to get a little creative. It's usually several of these factors that gets me to substantial and sustained deprivation of liberty. But again, if there's a minor, I don't need any of this. Go to the next slide. But if I don't have human trafficking, I still have plenty of options for what I can prosecute. We have pimping. All I need for pimping, the easy way to explain this is I just have to have somebody who knows that the person that they're working with is a commercial sex worker, and that the money that is being, obtained from that work, the defendant is using it in some manner. It doesn't matter what the manner is. So let's say there's a boyfriend-girlfriend situation where the boyfriend knows his girlfriend is a sex worker and she's doing it all by herself, right? It's rare, but let's pretend she's working all by herself. But she takes that money and she uses it to help pay their rent, even if it's just 50-50, I can still file pimping against that individual. So that's a tool we have when we can't prove trafficking, as long as there's some exchange of money or community purpose for this money, it's pimping. Pandering, there is like 7 different subsections to pandering. Persuading an individual to prostitute, encouraging her to work. And it doesn't matter if that individual was already a sex worker before the defendant got involved. So I have several situations where a survivor was working for years before she started working with her pimp. And, they say she was already working. I just was providing security for her. That's still pandering under the law. And then similar with exploitation of labor, we can't get to human trafficking. There's still plenty other ways under the law to prosecute it. Just obtaining property that somebody else has no right to, using any force, fear, that's usually enough for us to get some of these crimes prosecuted. But as Katrina mentioned, it is a lot harder, and we have a lot less cases for labor trafficking than we do for sex trafficking. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Katrina, as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, when we, I think sometimes when people, look at exploitation of labor and they think, obtaining property or other consideration, that means like work can be that other consideration that you get out of someone. And as far as the labor trafficking goes, I think what we have, what people are slowly figuring out is that the entire process for identifying those kind of situations is different and requires a different degree of community engagement and outreach, because very oftentimes you're looking at populations that are very much marginalized. So that can be because of, and highly vulnerable, it can be because of language barriers. It can be because of their immigration situation in the United States. It can be because they're unhomed. There can be a lot of different ways, but oftentimes those folks are less likely to reach out to a law enforcement agency or to a service provider, or they may not even realize that what's happening to them is actually a crime. And so all of those things can make it quite difficult. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to suggest that we skip this video, but I will drop a link to it in the chat toward the end if people want to take a look at it, because it's quite interesting. It does talk about the experience of two different sets of kind of survivors of labor trafficking. And do we want to take a few questions here?
We only had one since the last round, and it's a little bit of a detailed question, so I don't know if we'll be able to answer it right now or not. So, for example, if a minor is lured into an adult's home without that minor's parents' permission, why is the scenario difficult to resolve by law enforcement?
Yeah, it's hard. Okay, so the way that works is right now that's not a crime to have a minor in your house when, the minor wants to be there, the adult wants the minor to be there. There's no crime there. But what there is, a runaway juvenile. So in that situation, all officers can do is either return that juvenile home or bring them into a juvenile retaining center, like juvenile hall temporarily. And in most counties, we don't even do that anymore. Like, for example, in our county, Katrina, you might know this, I don't even think we allow that anymore unless the child literally has nowhere else to go, says, I can't go back to my parents because of X, Y, and Z. And then they're just held there temporarily until they can be brought into a foster home. So it's difficult because there is no code section. There is nothing that prevents a minor being in another adult's home.
Okay. That makes sense. That was the only other question, though.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move into a section where we talk a little bit about kind of what are some of the overarching dynamics that we see present in human trafficking, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, whether we're dealing with adults or minors. These are sort of the reason we put these in here is because these are, I think some of this information is oftentimes not commonly understood sort of by everyone working in the human trafficking space, right? So if you're coming from more of a law enforcement background, this may not have been sort of the way that human trafficking you initially learned about it or engaged with the issue, and vice versa on the the side of victim service providers. And so this is something that within the task force over time, we've been working on sort of developing a little bit more of this common understanding of what are sort of the forces that are at work in these situations that can make them challenging to work on. And how can we, in order to be trauma informed and victim centered, to some degree, we have to have a common understanding of what it is that we think are happening in these situations, besides the obvious thing of there may have been a violation of a law or something like that, so that we can work effectively with survivors. So the first, this first slide, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice given the time that we have, but I do want to at least say sort of, part of that context is looking at the systems level or the macro level, right? And one way that we do that is by talking about the role of intersectionality in human trafficking. And intersectionality is a framework or a way of understanding the systems of oppression or discrimination that can impact individuals' lives and lead to greater levels of vulnerability, right? And as we've been talking about this, vulnerability being sort of some of the key factors that expose people or put them at risk for trafficking. And so when we talk about the systems of oppression or discrimination, you can see up there, there's based on race, on class, on ethnicity, citizenship status, right? I mean, that puts you in a very different situation than someone who may be a citizen and have the necessary paperwork to prove that they have a right to reside in the United States. And so what this helps us to understand is the ways in which all of these things create layers of potential vulnerability, and they intersect to put people at a disadvantage in a situation where they might be at risk of human trafficking. So this is one lens that we bring to bear in sort of understanding how this happens. It also tells us a lot about the experience of the different people that we work with and things that we should think about in terms of experiences they may have had, traumas they may be experiencing, and vulnerabilities they may be struggling with. They also can create a lot of, or have a lot of effect on health or overall well-being of folks. That, of course, if we're thinking about coming to folks where they're at, and I see there's a hand raised, Natalie, that this helps us understand better that experience. Monica, if you don't mind, I'm gonna have us hold the question until the end of the section, but we will come back to it. So Natalie, flag if you don't mind for that one. So I'm not going to go through all of what you see on this slide, but when we've been talking about vulnerabilities, these are some examples of things that can create vulnerabilities, right? So we've talked a lot about migration or immigration status, level of education, and not in terms of, people that haven't been to school get trafficked more, but in understanding that one thing, for example, in labor trafficking that can greatly impact your ability to earn a living and to be able to survive is what economic opportunities are available to you. And one thing that we know is that with less training or preparation for job, that can sometimes make it extremely difficult for you to find a job. And when you're desperate for a job and you don't have a lot of options, that can make it easier for a trafficker to exploit you. We heard in the Ori Freeman case, her talk about sort of the relationship or of trust that she very quickly developed with the individual that ended up being her trafficker. And she had previous experience of abuse. She had a trauma history. She had a lot of other factors that were, had kind of been in place pre-existing her interaction with him that he was able to take advantage of. Lack of support. I think we also saw that in the Ori Freeman case. Poverty, not having, again, opportunities for other means to make money. So these just give a few different examples. And, of course, I think this probably goes without saying, but I will say it regardless. No single one of these things means that someone's going to be trafficked, right? Like this isn't, oh, okay, this person has trauma, well, then they're definitely going to be trafficked, or this person has lived in a home with family violence, they will be trafficked. No, it's, there's an overall constellation of people's life experiences and circumstances. But what we know is that we also see frequently that folks that have been trafficked may have some of these factors that were in their life pre-existing when the trafficking happened, and that those were the things that could be exploited to get them into a trafficking situation and to keep them there, right? The other thing that we see frequently is the role that trauma plays, right? And I think this is an area where I think there can be a lot of challenges for people who maybe don't have this background or training. And so it's an area that we hope to build out within the task force of really understanding how it is that trauma can affect a survivor of human trafficking and influence how they engage with, whether it's victim service providers or it's law enforcement folks, and can also help understand why it is so incredibly difficult for someone who've experienced trafficking to move away from that. And so, trauma, I think fundamentally, it sounds like there are a lot of service providers here, but we're talking about trauma is just a type of wound or an injury or a shock that someone has experienced and that is overwhelming to them. Trauma bonding is talked about quite a bit in the human trafficking space, and people have sort of different takes on this. But what we talk about when we talk about trauma bonding is it's an emotional bond that's formed, that can be formed between a survivor of human trafficking and their exploiter through this kind of recurring cyclical pattern of abuse, right? That's perpetuated by reinforcement from basically rewards and punishments, right? So this is where you might see in some, particularly I think we see it in sex trafficking, and I should say trauma bonding isn't necessarily present in every trafficking situation, but it can be, and we often will see that very strong relationships built between a trafficker and their survivor of human trafficking, and that the survivor really feels quite emotionally reliant on the trafficker for emotional connection, support, that is a significant relationship in their life, even though it can be quite abusive. And from someone looking from the outside may look at that and think, well, that just doesn't make any sense. Like, why would someone stick with someone that doesn't treat them very well? But trauma bonding is one way of kind of better understanding that. And then we have PTSD and complex trauma. And, PTSD used to exist sort of by itself without kind of this understanding of complex trauma. PTSD is a type of trauma that people can experience. Oftentimes it will be related to a single event, or it might be more a trauma that had happened in adulthood, whereas complex trauma is oftentimes understood to refer to trauma that initiates or starts frequently in adolescence or youth at a developmental phase. And that can really get locked into sort of the development of the brain and the individual's ability to deal with stress and difficult circumstances. I see another hand up, so we'll come back around to that one at the
Yeah, I'm gonna grab everybody that does have a hand raised, and then at the end we'll.
And so what's important, I think, to understand is that, so PTSD, the impacts that we see, we know that this can result in a lot of feelings of anger, guilt, shame, re-experiencing of trauma. Sometimes people refer to that as flashbacks, panic and anxiety, depression. Those are all factors that can come into play with PTSD. You can see a lot of the same things in complex trauma, but what you also sometimes will see are problems with sort of chronic emotional difficulties, negative self-view, a lot of difficulties having stable or safe relationships. And what I want to say about that is that if you think about this whole picture, that we've talked about, you can understand a little bit better why, when someone is maybe identified as someone that could be a potential victim of human trafficking, and they're presented, someone talks to them in that way or approaches them to, try to get them help, that they may not understand themselves to be a victim of human trafficking, that they may have a very strong bond with their trafficker and not identify as a victim. And they may also, even if they do identify as a victim or they want to move away from the trafficking situation, day-to-day functioning can be extremely difficult, because of all of the trauma that they've experienced. And so their decision-making or their perception of their experience may not match with what, other people looking in from the outside would think. And that part of being trauma informed and victim centered is to be able to meet people where they are and to be able to try to understand from their perspective what they're experiencing, and to give them the ability to take ownership of that and to empower them to identify their strengths for themselves, rather than trying to sort of impose our outside understanding of them and get them to behave in ways that we would think would make more sense. Right. And so this, for a lot of you that work in community-based organizations or that may have had a lot of training around trauma, this may already make absolute sense to you. But what I will say is that when we work in the human trafficking space, people have very different levels of exposure to this kind of information and ideas. And it may not, they may not have had this perspective shared with them. And so something that we are trying to do within the task force is build out so more of this common understanding, so that we can approach things from this perspective, and that we're sure that we're responding to people in the way that is going to help them and empower them to sort of move past the situation that they're in. And then finally, quickly, one last slide for this section, which just kind of goes to probably something that'll look very familiar to people that are more maybe in the social work space, but one way of conceptualizing some of what we just talked about is this idea of stages of change, right? That if you have experienced trafficking, you have become, very much sort of acclimated to what's happening, or you can become very acclimated to that. And so oftentimes what we find is that folks that we may approach may not be interested in, they may not identify as a victim, they may not be interested in receiving any services or getting any assistance, or they may accept some and then very quickly decide that they don't want any more services, and they may return to the trafficking situation. And so the stages of change just helps us to understand that, especially for folks that have experienced trauma, that there are sort of, different stages of motivation, right, for making a change in your life. And that often if folks are someone that maybe we came across in, a law enforcement encounter with a trafficker and a survivor happens to be with them, they may not be thinking of themselves as a survivor of human trafficking. They may have not contemplated leaving or not seriously be contemplating it. And so this helps us understand why, if a service provider or a law enforcement person says, oh, this, you're in this terrible situation, let us get you help and get away from this. And they may say, no, thank you. Or, maybe not so politely, right? Which I think law enforcement, historically sometimes has had a difficult time understanding, like, why we're here, we can help them, why don't they want the help? And stages of change helps us understand that people have to be thinking, they have to be in an emotional and a mental space to even be contemplating that they might want to make a change, really, before they're going to be prepared to act on it. And that's what you see in the cycle, right, is sort of pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, and action. And also that even if someone decides at one point that they do want to take some sort of action to change the situation that they're in, that they may do that and then a day or two later decide that that's not that's not what they want to do. And so it involves quite a bit of what you could think of as relapse, or kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And we have a lot of folks, so this presentation was kind of built out for audiences that include both law enforcement and social service providers. And so for those of you that have worked in the social service space or victim service space, this may seem very familiar to you. It is generally less so amongst law enforcement folks. And so that's part of why we talk about it. And I think we had a couple questions.
We do. Yeah, let me find Monica if she's still here. Monica, can you raise your hand again? See if she's here or not. Not seeing it. And then the other one, I believe, was Dominique. They may have both stepped away. We do have one other question, which was that a question around like opportunities to be able to improve penal code or trainings for law enforcement to be able to spot trafficking sooner and potentially, especially in cases of minor, be able to help stop that cycle of, you know, if they can catch them earlier, you can prevent something from happening.
I mean, I think that's part of what we do as the task force is we are committed to providing trainings to not only law enforcement, but working with our service providers to make sure that they're working with law enforcement in these situations. And many of our officers are already actively engaging in this. Many of our agencies, when they're confronted with these situations, the first place they go to is to CVS, is to FJC, or they bring advocates from those entities with them to talk to these at-risk minors or individuals who we know are already actively engaging in commercial sex work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was the only other question that came up though.
Okay, great. So I think in the interest of time, there's a couple slides and knowing kind of who's in our audience, there's a couple slides we'll maybe jump over because it seems like these folks are likely to maybe have a better understanding of those. But I did want to at least give us a chance maybe on the identification slide to talk briefly about kind of key indicators. And then Jessica, I don't know if you wanted to say sort of a few words about the investigation slide
Sure.
Once we get there. Okay, so I'm assuming from the group that we have that there's probably pretty good understanding of what we mean by trauma-informed, victim-centered. And I talked about multidisciplinary earlier. In terms of indicators, I think I'll give a few examples. I'm just going to pull kind of all of these up. You know, things that we see with labor trafficking as a potential indicator are, you know, folks that are not in control of their money potentially. They may talk about owing a large debt, and they may not have access to or be in control of their identity or other important documents. And those are ones that we see kind of more specifically to labor trafficking. For sex and labor, we will see we can see restricted movement or monitoring and control. And this can be both for, you know, on a sex trafficking side or on the labor trafficking side. They may not, when approached by someone, they may not speak on their own behalf. So other people talking in their place or kind of jumping into conversation. I know, you know, I've heard several scenarios where this has happened in medical settings or with first responders where there's obviously something going on and the first responder or the medical person is trying to ask the individual what's going on with them, and there's a third party that just keeps kind of stepping in and answering. And also being confused about whereabouts. And if you think about kind of the nature of both labor and sex trafficking, they can be very mobile. They can be folks that are being sent to different places to work or to engage in commercial sex work, and they may not always know where they're at. They may have very little opportunity to be away from the location where they're being trafficked. And so when they are, they don't really have any sense of where they're at. They may have never been told. So those are kind of some key indicators in those groups. And then I think Jessica is going to talk a little bit about sex trafficking indicators.
Yeah, again, of course, this list doesn't include all of the things we see, just, you know, some of the things that we've been seeing lately or more prominently, branding and tattoos, especially on our younger sex workers or our runaway juveniles. If a juvenile is coming back to a group home and she has a tattoo of a male on her, that is something that is causing a huge red flag, hopefully not only for the group home, but for any law enforcement officer who was tasked with bringing her back. Older boyfriend and girlfriend, we're not just talking about a couple of years. We're talking about an 18-year-old with, a 45-year-old, or a 17-year-old with a 28-year-old. The terminology is constantly changing, but there are a couple of key things that remain the same. And when these traffickers are talking about trafficking on things like Snapchat, Instagram, it's still pretty obvious. One of the things I've been seeing lately is them talking about going out to eat. I need you to go out to eat, and I need you to eat this much, and it's going to cost this much. And tell me when you leave the restaurant and when you're going to go get dessert. Like, it's very obvious what they're getting at here. But so you'll see a lot of that type of terminology through phones. Obviously, phones is huge. If there are multiple phones, we want to get into at least one of those phones. One of those phones is probably going to be clean, and the other one is not going to be clean. The other one is going to have apps that we can't get access to. As you all have heard, we can get search warrant returns. We get lots of information from places like Snapchat, Instagram, but there are dozens of apps that are based outside the US that these traffickers are using to communicate with their sex workers that I can't get access to. So that's getting into those phones and being able to look at those apps from the cell phones is obviously huge. And then just some of the obvious things that are big indicators: lots of cash, condoms, hotel keys. If a juvenile is coming home with we were using this example yesterday, a Coach bag, and you know she's working minimum wage. Those are types of indicators we see.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And I think maybe we'll hit 2 last slides, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. So we talked about kind of key principles up top, and one of those was being multidisciplinary in our approach. And when we were developing these slides with the partners, one of the things that we talked about was, what does it look like to be a collaborative multidisciplinary task force? And so key sort of factors that people talked about were obviously collaboration, communication, coordination, and mutual respect. And so how do we build that into the work that we do together? So some of the ways that we've been doing that is to really get explicit. So when it's easy to say collaboration, but what does that look like on a day-to-day basis in interacting with one another? What does that look like when a victim service provider is approached by a survivor who tells them about their trafficking that they're experiencing, and their, what is the conversation that will be had? How will they approach whether or not that individual wants to be involved in a criminal justice process or make a report of that happening? How do we, if we're going to go out on, what we will call like a proactive operation, which means going out and potentially identifying individuals that may be being trafficked out in the community, how are we going to do that? Who's going to be involved in that? Is law enforcement going to go by themselves? If they're working with victim advocates, at what stage will the victim advocates be able to talk with the survivors? So what we've been doing within the task force is working on building out written protocols that kind of detail how that's done. And doing, one example would be with proactive operations, that we do planning together jointly with law enforcement and victim service providers to talk about every detail, down to, okay, so are they, are the victim service providers going in the cars with law enforcement? Are they getting called in separately, on an on-call basis? How are we going to ensure that a potential survivor is separated from their trafficker so that they have an opportunity to speak freely if they want to do that? Where if a victim advocate that has confidentiality with their client is speaking with a survivor, where is the law enforcement officer going to be? Are they going to be giving space so that that conversation can happen? All of those details. For law enforcement, it's victim service providers can sometimes be, depending on their confidentiality arrangement with the client, it may be that They can at least be a bridge to law enforcement, not saying that the service provider would communicate anything out of turn to law enforcement. They can at least ask, would you be interested in talking with a law enforcement officer, and provide that as an option. And then from the victim service provider side, continued engagement and information sharing. Very often, if the survivor has reported what's going on, they want to know what's happening on the law enforcement side or on the criminal justice side. So collaborating and having a protocol in place for how that communication happens and how victims can remain updated on what's going on. And then Jessica, did you want to say for this slide a word about what that can look like from a prosecution perspective in terms of collaborating with victim service folks?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, once we get to the point where I'm prosecuting a case, there's only a handful of scenarios where I'll actually need the victim in court with me. And that's if I choose to put them on to testify at the preliminary hearing, which is a short, basically mini trial we put on in front of a judge so that the judge can determine whether or not there's enough evidence to proceed. And then, of course, there's the trial where I'm going to need a victim to testify. So there's a lot of considerations that I have on whether or not I'm going to put a victim on a preliminary hearing or not. And it's some of the things that we've already discussed, the victim-centered approach, trauma-informed approach. But whenever I do have a victim in my office, that's the best opportunity that we have to get together as a group and try to provide services for that victim. So we do collaborate with our service providers. Do you have a place to sleep tonight? Do you want us to try and find somewhere for you to sleep tonight? Here's money for lunch. How did you get here? You'd be surprised how many times I've have cases where an individual is getting driven to court on a case against a trafficker by another trafficker, that she's switched to a different abuser. So that's how we're kind of all working together when it comes to those court dates, because obviously I have the power of subpoena, which means when I subpoena somebody, they have to come to court. So it is one of our only chances where we know when the victim is going to be open to hearing from us and what we can provide. And we can actually restrict who comes into our office. So we're not going to let in her most current abuser.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think the last, I'm not going to say much about this because we just have a few minutes left, but in terms of comprehensive victim services, when we talk about that, we're really sort of speaking about kind of these 5 key areas, right? And I think basic needs is sort of self-explanatory, probably case management and health as well. Legal advocacy can be everything from immigration to records clearance, which is called vacatur in the legal system. Everything from social security benefits, other government benefits that folks might be eligible for, custody matters, family law issues that can sometimes come up for survivors. The other area which references education and job training, right? That can be a huge issue for survivors of human trafficking, and I think is an area where we very much still are trying to build this out. The other area that I would flag that constantly comes up as a challenge is shelter and transitional housing, because very often it can be important for human trafficking survivors to be in a shelter space or transitional housing space where folks are familiar with working with clients who have that experience, and can help them navigate that experience and potentially find them a place where they're going to feel comfortable. So that's all I'll say about that. I know we have very little time left. So Natalie, do we have a few minutes for questions? 2 or 3?
Absolutely. And I'm happy to unmute anybody if you want to raise your hand, if you want to ask your question, because we'd love to be able to have some folks come in. One of the questions that was posed was actually about shelter. What shelters are in Contra Costa County for human trafficking survivors, if any?
Yeah, so we have worked with STAND. So they operate a shelter here in Contra Costa County, and they do take clients that have experienced interpersonal violence. And so, human trafficking is one of the 5 dimensions of interpersonal violence. So that is that is a shelter here in the county that we've worked with quite a bit. We also, honestly, either because there's no space available in the county, or because the survivor themselves prefers to be out of the immediate area. So sometimes their trafficker is, in the community where they're at, and they don't want to be there if they're trying to move away, get away from them. So we also work with Ruby's Place in Oakland and Alameda County. And as I mentioned earlier, my sister's house up in Sacramento. There's also a Solano County shelter that we've worked with in the past as well through the Sane Start program up there called the Abundant Place. And they're kind of a newer shelter. So those are the places that we often work with. But again, this is a real sort of high need area, I would say, with respect to survivor needs in human trafficking.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions that folks might have? And just while you're thinking about that, we are recording this training, and we will be able to email both the recording of the training and the slides. We also have, if you could take a minute to please fill out a survey evaluation about the training today. I just put it in the chat. It's a quick Google form. It's going to take 1 minute to fill out, but we really value the feedback from these because we want to improve. We want to keep the stuff that's good, and we want to improve on the stuff that we need to improve on. And we can only do that if we get your feedback. I'm not seeing any other hands or questions or anything. So I want to thank both Katrina and Jessica so much for being a part of our Family Justice Institute today. It is Human Trafficking Awareness Month in January, so we are grateful that you both are here and able to provide your expertise on this issue. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.